You're listening to If Only I Were Wiser podcast, where Raina Wilson brings together wisdom and raw life stories to provide encouragement and truth. So many times it's easy to become discouraged in your own pursuit of health because your story or circumstances look drastically different from your favorite influencer or even the expectations you had for yourself. If that is you, welcome! This space is for you to learn, breathe, and maybe just listen and see what wellness could look like for you. Hey friends, welcome back to the If Only I Were Wiser podcast. On today's episode, I'm super excited to share Katelyn Fusco with you from the Happy Homebirth podcast. Katelyn is a homebirth mother, a childbirth educator, and an experienced homebirth attendant. She has seen birth from many angles, literally, and knows the impact that this transformative event can have on you, your baby, and your entrance into motherhood. There is no gatekeeping in this episode. We touch on things like homebirth statistics, how to be educated and informed making decisions, and how to create the best healthy and safe birth experience for you. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, Katelyn, I would say welcome back because, we'll see how time 2 goes. But welcome to the If Only I Were Wiser podcast.
So, Rena, thank you so much for having me.
I am just thankful that we get to do this all over again. And I love reintroducing you because I've just loved your content and I'm thankful for your platform. But I would love to get to know you a little bit better and introduce you to our community.
Awesome. Yep. So my name is Katelyn Fusco. I am the host of the Happy Homebirth podcast. I am a mother to 3 children now, which is, I'm still getting used to saying that. We have a 6-year-old daughter, a 4-year-old daughter, and then we just had a little boy in May. So we've got 3 right now, all born at home, and a wonderful hunky husband that I adore. So that is our family.
Love that. Yes.
How did you get started in this space? I'm sure that it has a major role in your own story. So let's start there.
Yeah. So, I do feel like a lot of these things it's like this weird, twisty, windy road to get to where we are. And I definitely feel like the Lord's hand was in this because it doesn't make any sense. I was a sign language interpreter, and that was what I went to school for. I loved it in school. And then as I began to work, I just started wondering, was there something else that I was meant to be doing? And around that time when I graduated college, I was changing so much. This was back when I graduated in 2013. And so around that time is when I was kind of going into the crunchy community. I was learning more about, the Weston A. Price Foundation. I found the Weston A. Price Foundation, and that kind of changed my entire perspective on life, I'd say. And so I ended up trying to become a nutritional coach, like a health coach. And during that training, I was told, you really need to niche down. And I started thinking, what better way to serve the future generations than to work with their parents? So I started wanting to work with mothers and pregnant mothers in particular. And I got a little weird about it because I thought maybe midwives, maybe I had just learned what midwives were not long before. And I thought maybe midwives clients would be the ones that would be interested in this. So I started sleuthing around on our DHEC website to find the list of midwives in South Carolina and just started calling them one by one. The first one that answered turned out to be, it was a godsend. She ended up becoming my preceptor. So I worked with her as a student. It was because as soon as I met her, I was just like, whoa, there's something here. I think I'm supposed to be in the midwifery world somewhere. So I began working for her. I was a student midwife. On that journey, as I was working for her, I became pregnant with my first. And so that was so cool. What an amazing experience, because I was receiving care from her at the same time as providing care with her for other mothers, and just seeing this whole 360 view of what it means, this client midwife relationship, what it means to give birth at home. I was experiencing it from all of these angles. And then I did give birth at home with my first. It was a long labor, but we made it. We did it.
Yeah.
And I do feel like it's one of those things where, like, if I had been at the hospital, there's no telling what would have happened.
Yeah.
But gave birth. I continued to apprentice. And then by the time my baby was like 10 months old, she was hitting toddlerhood. And I know that sounds like crazy because she was a baby, but she really made that transition quick. And
Yep.
my midwife moved away, and it was like perfect timing because I needed to be all hands on deck with this precious new life that was, starting to really explore the world. But it wasn't long into that before I started wondering, how can I continue to work with mothers? How can I keep this conversation going? And I remember so many of the moms kind of had the same complaint in our prenatals, and that was that they felt alone. They felt isolated, which makes sense. There's less than 2% of mothers giving birth at home. No wonder they felt alone and isolated. And so that's how the podcast got created. It was really an opportunity to present a platform where mothers could share their home birth stories so that, number one, they could share their story because that's amazing. And number two, others could feel this camaraderie, this connection, this recognition that, like, hey, you're not the only one doing this. So that's where it started. I then began realizing that we actually needed deeper resources in order to prepare for home birth adequately, yes, but even more so to prepare for that sacred transition into motherhood, and really prepare for how beautiful that can be. So that's where we are now.
Absolutely. Where would you suggest that we start? Because like I've mentioned, I think I saw my first like live birth on Instagram.
Yeah.
Like, what? And my mom had C-section, so it wasn't a conversation. And I was really first introduced to this whole world outside of, the bright lights, the sterile gloves, and the mechanized birth through social media. So where do we even start? Because there's a lot of noise around this topic.
Yep. There really is. And it seems, if we are to look at the exterior world, like if we're to look at our culture, our society, what are we being told? Really, what we're being told is, your body can't do this. Like, it's not able to do it. You need somebody else to do this for you. You need somebody to save you from your own body. You need somebody to save your child from you, from your body. So go to this location and have somebody do that for you. But really, it's a facade. Because if we think about this, gosh, hospitals are a blip in history. Giving birth in hospitals, it's a tiny blip. So where do we start? I think that we start at the beginning. We start back from all of human history. How have we been giving birth? Up until very recently, the only option was giving birth at home. And it's worked pretty darn well, thank you very much. Like, look at our society. We've made it. We're good. And there have been medical advancements, and thank goodness for them. Thank goodness for the hospital when it's needed. Like, the two things don't have to be diametrically opposed to one another. We don't have to be dogmatic about either view. But oh my word, what if we could just go back to the way it's always been and give birth physiologically probably 95% of the time? Wouldn't that be incredible?
Absolutely. And I remember telling my husband, like, because again, we're a military family, so we didn't have a lot of options. So we did what we could with the options we were given and prepared us accordingly. But one of the things that I had told him was, if God designed my body intimately and beautifully, then it should be able to do its job. But that narrative went out the door as soon as I was admitted to be induced. And not of even my own accord, because I think I've shared this on the podcast episode. But long story short, we had a midwife see late on a non-stress test that she had me come in early for. Come to find out, within the hour that I was like triaged, she had wanted to put me on Pitocin because she had a wrist surgery the next morning and wanted to count me towards her however many babies. That being said,
Stop.
I think, unfortunately, for a lot of women, they have the negative experience. And I do think that the Lord had his hand over my birth. There were a lot of very beautiful moments. I had amazing nurses that I, without a doubt, would not have gotten through literally 4 days in the hospital with all of the interventions. I want to do this differently next time. So what would you say are 3 ways that you can prepare yourself as a mother, holistically, whatever, mind, body, spirit, to feel encouraged to even initiate this conversation within your own heart as a mother?
Oh, yeah. This is such a great question. And I think that the first one is detaching yourself from what you're seeing around you. So we first have to recognize that there is another option. So many mothers are, the way that they're finding out about home birth and considering it is because they've had a prior bad experience, similar to what you're saying, where it was like intervention after intervention, 4 days in the hospital, ending in a C-section. Like, that's not the ultimate goal of how we visualize this happening, right? But that's what's happening to a lot of mothers. And so the first thing we have to do is realize, okay, that happened, but it doesn't have to happen that way next time. There are other ways that I can go about this. What this society is telling me is normal is not necessarily normal. There could be another way. So it first just takes kind of like this place of like imagination, kind of like a what if, like, what if I could do it differently? What would that be like? What if my body really was designed, you were woven together in your mother's womb? Like, oh my gosh, like, doesn't that sound so intentional? That's craftsmanship. Like, weren't you crafted for this? Like, that's amazing. So when we start kind of detaching ourselves from the current narrative, and I think a lot more people are doing this lately anyway, because like we're seeing like, hey, all this stuff isn't adding up. Like, what? Maybe there's another way. Maybe there's something else for me. So first, we're kind of just separating from what we've experienced in the past, and then next, I think that it's the step of seeing what is possible. So obviously, I mean, I'm biased, but I really do think that listening to other people's experiences is so powerful. It is so powerful just to hear what the variation of normal is. Because if you listen to a podcast episode and then you pick 5 more, they are all going to be different. They're all going to have very different nuances. Whereas what's interesting, and I haven't actually really thought about this until now, but a lot of times when people describe their hospital births, it's a very similar format. But when we are left to give birth physiologically, it is often very different. There are all of these different ways that it happens. So we can hear the vast variation of normal. And then after that, the other thing that I think is so important, this is number 3, would be to actually spend time asking yourself what it is that you want in your birth experience. Like, what does that look like for you to transform into or back into motherhood through this unbelievable experience called birth? What do you want out of that? What's important to you? And then once you know what's important to you, then you can begin to educate yourself on how to make that happen. Yeah. But I think that a critical misstep for many of us is the assumption of like, okay, well, I don't want to have what happened in the hospital happen, so I'm just going to go see a midwife at home, and that's the end. That's all I have to do. And the reality is that what is so potent about home birth is taking responsibility for your own birth. It's taking that responsibility, that kind of heavy weight of responsibility, and putting it on your shoulders instead of putting it on somebody else. So if we just, go from hospital to home birth, but we're still like giving somebody else all of the responsibility, it may not work out exactly the same. So I do think that piece of what do I want? Okay, now how can I prepare for that is critical.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on it, like being confident or comfortable enough to push against all the noise. And that might mean taking a little bit more autonomy and authority over that, including family and friends, you know?
Yep. Oftentimes.
Yes. So where do you think that comes from? Like, where do you think that fear comes from? Because again, I'm sure a lot of it is well-intentioned. Like, we haven't even initiated this conversation with our family. This is, because it's an intimate, ultimately our decision between my husband and I, ultimately my decision. But
yeah,
where do you think this like taboo, like super crunchy, you're so woo-woo if you take your baby from, you're going to all of your ultrasounds and doctor's appointments to entering into the home birth conversation?
Yeah. And you touched on this. I think it's so important to recognize that this is, a lot of times I think that mothers can feel they can become angry, because they're not getting the support that they need. And I get it. I hear you. It is so frustrating to not feel supported. But if we can change our perspective just a little bit and realize that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes these people are concerned. They don't have the education. They don't realize that home birth is actually a safe option. They haven't looked at the studies. Many home birth moms have, because believe it or not, home birth moms are the researchers. They're the ones that are making really researched choices. It's not just like, I'm going to be crazy. Like,
sure.
No, we're thinking. So oftentimes it comes from just a lack of education, a lack of understanding. And they hear home birth and they think, oh no, you're gonna die. Like, that's so scary. Why would you ever do that? Now, obviously the data shows that no, that's not true. And actually in the United States, maternal mortality rate is abysmal. And it's not coming from the 2% of home birthers. So, there are some more questions there that we could get into. But the problem is a lack of information. So if we can acknowledge, like, they're coming from a place of love, it's just not, they're not, it's not the best way, then we can either choose to educate them and say, hey, I love you. Our relationship is really important. And I know that you want to support me. Let me give you these podcast episodes to listen to. Let me show you this study. So we can choose to educate, which can be really helpful, especially for people who want to be on our side, but like maybe just don't know and are scared. Educate them. The other thing that we can do is we can set up boundaries, because guess what? This experience, birth, is a microcosm of the macrocosm of motherhood. You're gonna have to set up boundaries. Like, you're gonna make decisions that other people don't like. That is the nature of motherhood. You're going to do stuff and your aunt's going to think you're doing it wrong. You're going to do stuff and your dad is like, well, we did it differently. Like, that's the nature of it. So why don't we just get comfortable with the discomfort now and set the boundaries if it's not working out? Like, hey, we can't talk about this clearly, or just don't tell anybody. Like, it is your personal medical information. So I think that there are several ways to go about it. But once again, overall, the big theme is that our entire society for so long has been told, you can't do this thing, you're not good at this thing, you need somebody else. And so that's what our parents believe, because that's what they were told. No wonder. And they didn't have Instagram to see the birth stories. They didn't have podcasts. There were so few resources. So it makes sense, but the beauty is that we can be the bridge back to a more physiological approach, because we do have the resources. We can't just be tricked into, oh, well, my body just doesn't work, because no, we see other people doing it. So it's a really beautiful place for us to be in, and we can actually impart that onto our children. And we know that when they grow up, we're going to be these supportive parents who are like, yes, I know your body works. You saw me give birth. Like, you're doing it. This is so amazing. And how cool is that?
Yeah, I love that. And maybe this disconnection from the greater narrative is the answer to this question. But this has been an area where my husband and I have gone back and forth. You know, we did the full hospital thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're using discernment and prayer and research to not just, like you said, dive to the other end of the spectrum and just be like, well, I'm not in a hospital, so I checks the box.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's like this underlying fear, or rather, especially with VBAC mamas, that
Mm-hmm.
something is going to go wrong, because that was exactly what was spoken over my body. I remember laying in my hospital bed and thinking, my body is broken. And then, I entered the hospital thinking the Lord designed my body, and left, even still currently processing, like, my body is broken.
Mm-hmm.
And then make medical decisions with my husband about, well, once you had a C-section, then you have to have a C-section, and there's this and this and this risk. All that to say, maybe it is specifically for VBAC mamas, or stepping away from the medical sphere once you've had that experience. How do you speak to the people that I'm sure, like, hospitals exist for a reason, because what if those X, Y, and Z things happen and you're at home?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, good questions right now. So first of all, let's look at the data. And the data says that if you want a VBAC, your best chance of having one is at home by a long shot.
Wow.
Like, by a painful long shot. I cannot remember the percentage of mamas in the hospital who attempt to have a VBAC and then are successful, but it's pretty small. It's a pretty small percentage. Whereas mothers who plan to have a VBAC at home, they have an 87% success rate.
Wow.
87%. Like, that's huge. So if we're just looking at the data, then really, if we want the VBAC, that is the best place to be.
Right.
Now, such great questions of this concern of, like, well, what if something bad does happen? If something bad happens and you're at home, the reality is that when we're in the hospital, these care providers, they've been, like, their schooling was in pathology. So they're looking for pathology. And when you're looking for pathology, guess what you're probably going to find? You're probably going to find something to pathologize, because that's what you've been trained to do. Now, meanwhile, when we are talking about the midwifery model of care, just home birth in general, we're not really looking for pathology. That happens, but what we're looking for is a normal physiological birth. The training, the focus is on the fact that 95% of the time, if left alone, completely untouched, a mother's going to give birth completely fine and everything's going to go great. So the assumption is everything's great here. Now, because they are so trained in normal physiological birth, they also know when red flags are popping up. Is something off? Well, I see that that's off. So what I'm going to do is try to manage the situation in a way that brings everything back into line. But if red flag number 1 pops up, and then red flag number 2, and then red flag number 3 is like looking a little questionable, that is the moment when your care provider is going to say to you, hey, look, we've got these things going on, and I'm noticing that these things are popping up, and we're kind of sliding outside of that realm of normal physiological birth.
Yeah.
I think that the safest place for you at this point would be the hospital. It is not like, I mean, the chance of a severe emergency just dropping and nobody was expecting anything.
Yeah.
There were no warning signs. That's not how it happens. That's not what happens. What happens is there are, your blood pressure has changed.
Right.
Okay, the baby's heart tones are changing. Okay, it's looking like it's time for us to get in your car and drive to the hospital. Almost always, that's the way that it happens. Rarely is even an ambulance involved in this situation. So it's really important to recognize that. It's also really important to recognize that the vast majority of home birth transports are not for emergent reasons. They are for maternal fatigue. They're for exhaustion. And So when we recognize that, it's about 10% of home births they transport to the hospital. Number one, 10% is a small percent. Number two, the vast majority of that percentage is for maternal fatigue. So we're seeing like, okay, this is a pretty small window. And even those moms who are transporting for other reasons, it's not like, oh, everything's, hit the wall. It's usually we're transporting now because we're going to prevent anything negative from happening. We see that the hospital is the place to be in this situation. There is extra monitoring, all of the things that you may need there. So that's where we're going to go. So I think that that's a really critical piece of understanding of it's not just this situation where like, oh, like something bad's happened. We're all done. We're doomed. And then the other thing that I think is really important for us to recognize is that in the hospital situation, there is this sanitization. Like the assumption, the blanket assumption is if you're in the hospital, you're okay. Nothing bad can happen to you in the hospital. That is not my experience in the hospital. Personally, that's not my experience. Personally, I've seen plenty of births that should have been normal and beautiful go south as opposed to the other way around, And so I think that it's really important for us to realize that it's kind of a narrative. It's kind of just a false idea of hospital equals good, home equals bad. That's not really how it works. So what if we decided, okay, well, I'm going to start at home because this is a normal physiological birth. And if something changes, then I could go to the hospital for that additional monitoring and support that is so helpful if I'm not low risk anymore.
Yeah, that's such an encouraging point because, it just provides more room, I think, for the family and mom to make wise decisions without the fear. And I think you're right. It ultimately comes back to the overarching theme for moms in general is you are not a safe or wise mother if you give birth at home. Like we lived on a military base, so we were literally less than 2 minutes from the hospital, just where we were on post. And so when at the time that we went in for our non-stress test, it wasn't planned. I already had one scheduled, but they wanted me to come in. At the time that they had decided, hey, I need you to stay because your baby has decels on the monitor. I don't know what that is. My husband doesn't know what that is. Nobody explained it to us, but it was at that point emergent. Whatever. We weren't even allowed to go home because I just remember looking at my husband and thinking like, hey, like we didn't pack for the hospital. I was like, can I go home and mentally, emotionally, spiritually process the fact that I will never walk into this home again as me, like I wanted literally 5 minutes to walk home, grab my bags and say, the next time I come home, I'm going to be like a full-blown mother. Like I'm going to have a small child with me. And they had me sign they didn't have me sign it. I wouldn't even say threatened because it's a little aggressive, but that's what it felt like. It was, you need to sign the paperwork that says you're a horribly irresponsible mother and causing your baby doom if you decide to leave. We were literally going to come back, but I think that encapsulates the theme, or at least like from my own experience of what Western medicine creates, like exactly what you said, to pathologize birth. So in this conversation, there's obviously a lot of discernment for everybody. I've also heard a lot about midwives versus midwives. You find the ones that you're like, cool, this is like outside the scope of the hospital. And then, nobody's perfect, but they're pathologizing my whole birth at home. So what encouragement would you give to the discernment process of choosing care, supportive care for your birth environment?
Gosh, I want to be totally upfront here. This is really hard. This part is really hard because there's only so much that we can know about this care provider. And depending on where you are in the United States, you may not have a lot of options. And that's really frustrating. But what I would say is, once again, it does kind of come back to figuring out before you even speak to this midwife. So hopefully before you've even become pregnant, if that's possible, deciding what's important to you, what is critical. So I like to think of a few examples are like, with a lot of midwives, a lot of legislation, a lot of times it's not the midwife's fault. It's the regulations that are, put upon them. Which there's that balance of like, well, do I want to be regulated? I want to be licensed, or like, there's a lot.
Right.
It's a lot going on. But a lot of these regulations are like, you can't have a client after 42 weeks. They've got to go to the hospital, or like you can't attend a breech birth. All of these different regulations where a mother may feel very differently. So for me, I want to ask my care provider up front, what's going to happen? If I hit 42 weeks, like,
Right.
what's going to happen? Or what if my baby's breech? How is that going to look? So asking all of the questions. What if I don't want an ultrasound? Like, what's that going to be like? What if I don't want the GBS test? What if I don't want the gestational diabetes test? All of the things that are important to you, what's important to me is possibly very different from what's important to you, Raina. Like, you may want every single test, or you may want no test. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's your choice. It's the autonomy that's important, not the choice. But then we want to be able to find a care provider who understands what it is that you're looking for and feels confident in the fact that they can provide that for you. That's the ultimate goal. Is that going to be, is there going to be maybe some compromising? I wish that was never even a thing. I wish we didn't have to compromise. But like I said, unfortunately, there are not every midwife is perfect, and not every place has a lot of midwives. So it's kind of figuring out, all right, well, what am I going to do in that situation? And if they have said like, no, I can't support that. Okay, well then what are you going to do? Are you going to do what the recommendation is? Are you going to do something differently? You just need to know beforehand. You need to decide or mind what's important to you. And you can't do that unless you know what your options are. So there is a lot of this like pre-educating that can be so powerful. If we know these things beforehand, it can just allow for such a smoother experience. And a lot of times that's not how it happens. A lot of times we become pregnant and then we're like, oh, I should probably focus on this, which is fair. It happens to us. But if we have the opportunity to kind of do this like prep work, this mental prep work, this emotional, spiritual prep work beforehand, wow, that can give us such a leg up in the experience.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on it, but where do you because I think I've heard free birth, and that's a whole new other term in this home birth, like that's a whole added layer to the home birth conversation.
Oh boy. Yep.
So what is your take kind of on these prenatal appointments or checkups, or I wouldn't even say they're interventions. But at times, like as I've processed this in my own heart, I kind of feel like it's the fingers of the Western medicine sphere just leaching out just a little bit farther. And I've heard, I've talked to Elizabeth Parsons and just different things on ultrasounds. So what is kind of your take on all of these prenatal assessments, and are they really needed, or should they come into the conversation when you're trying to discern a home birth?
Yeah, I think the benefit of, or the good news about working with a midwife is that you really can have all the testing that you would have in the hospital if that's what you want. Do you want a bunch of ultrasounds? Then you can schedule those. You're not like, it's not off limits. And midwives are providing a lot of the testing, or at least outsourcing, for those tests. So you're still going to get blood draws if you want your blood drawn. You're still going to get ultrasounds if you want them. You can have all of these things. However, when working with a midwife, oftentimes there is way more flexibility if you don't want them. And I am a decliner. by nature. I'm just gonna like give me a piece of paper and I'm just checking decline. Like I don't want it. So I think that is once again, it's so individual. And for some people, it may be that getting the tests makes you feel safe. Like it makes you feel like, all right, there are eyes on this. It's being watched. Like I feel comfortable. For others, though, it may be that those tests kind of, I'm trying to think of a way to put it. I feel like for me, the reason that I don't like to do testing of any kind is because I want to focus on my connection with my baby, and I want to focus on the growth of my intuition. And when there's all this noise, I mean, oh my word, ultrasounds are so off so much of the time. They bring up a lot of fear in a lot of situations where there wasn't any need. And I know there are going to be people who say like, well, my baby had this and we would have only known because we had the ultrasound, and I hear you, and that's valid. I'm not saying that's not ever the case, but there are also a lot of people who think that there's something wrong when there's not. And that, what kind of stress does that provide at the same time? So yeah, I think for me, I really love to be able to kind of hone in, to focus inward, to connect with my baby, to spend all of that prenatal time loving this human that's already here, that's the closest to me he or she will ever be. Like you can't be any closer than inside of me. And getting to know them and listening to my body, which guess what is telling me so much about what's going on. That is my goal. And I do believe that if there was something that needed to be screened or seen, oftentimes I would have the indication beforehand, intuitively, because I have focused so much on building that primal skill. So yeah, that's, once again, it varies from person to person, and I would never be like, oh, well, you just should never do anything ever.
Sure.
Like, you got to do what works best for you. But here we go again with the idea of just know that there are other options. Just knowing that there are other options is so helpful.
And I think I would be amiss to not add this into our conversation, because personally, our family are Christians, and that is a major foundation to the way that we approach the world, especially birth. Like, I do feel like the Lord is sovereign over the womb and his timing and his creation, whatever goes on. So that being said, where do you think faith plays a role in prenatal care, dealing with all the noise and the fears and the, like you said, trusting the Lord during that sweet season, as well as the actual birth process itself?
This is a really beautiful question. And I, even when I'm speaking about intuition, that is Holy Spirit given, in my opinion. I mean, that is a direct connection, in my opinion, with the Lord. And so once again, it is cutting out all of, isn't this like so many things? We can get so distracted. You could choose to sit and scroll on Instagram literally all day, and your newsfeed would populate with more and more and more and more. And that's what you can choose to do. Or we can choose, you know what, I'm putting this aside and I'm going to focus on what's real and focus on what's here right now. For me, and especially, I feel like this is grown in every pregnancy. When I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, I was not a believer, and it was actually her birth that changed that. Because when I met her and realized, like, whoa, like there was so much more love in my heart, and it's just been dormant this whole time. I thought I knew my heart, and now it's expanded. Like, what else don't I know? It really like stoked the fire and really brought me to that place. So with each passing birth, by the time I had my second daughter, I really was more prayerful. And by the time that I had Thomas, my third, that was what my prenatal preparation was. It was communing with the Lord. It was recognizing that peace, like true ultimate peace, is a person. It's Jesus. And all of the other fake pieces that I was trying to find, which may be for some people, the outsourcing. It may be like, oh, the piece of an ultrasound shows me that my baby is okay in this second. But like at the second that the Doppler is gone, like, then what? You're back to faith. So for me, it was a lot of like not outsourcing, but focusing on communing with the Lord. And that was a really beautiful process. One of the things that I have my students do inside of my program, the Homebirth Collective, is we write a psalm. And that was not my idea. It's Adam something from the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. That was his idea. And I tell all my students to do that because it's just so powerful, especially for birth. But so like we write a psalm and we cry out to the Lord, and we're really honest with our hearts and our desires, and it's all about relationship, right? And so that for me was the most important thing. I had a sense of peace, and actually a friend of mine spoke that over me. She was like, I feel like the Holy Spirit is just telling me that this peace that you have, like you're passing this to your child. And it was so powerful. And it's true because our babies are inside of our womb. They're experiencing what we're experiencing. They're experiencing the hormones. They're experiencing the spiritual things. And so for me, it was all about providing an environment for just perfect peace, just this deep, beautiful trusting and peace. And yeah, that carried over into birth because that's all that I knew. That's all my baby knew. We had this beautiful, peaceful experience. Even when my baby was breached at 36 weeks, it was like, okay, well, like, whatever. It's gonna,
all right.
If he's born with his bottom first, like, he's still gonna be fine. And he did flip. But, like, just really focusing on that, it naturally went into the birth experience. And I will admittedly say that I was in denial in labor, did not realize how far along I was. And at one point it was like it got really obvious that I was about to have the baby. And like we weren't sure if we were going to call my midwife anyway, but at that point it was like, well, the baby's coming.
Yeah, we're here.
I just remember looking at my husband and saying, this is good. Like, this is really good. And just feeling that heavy piece of like, this was what it was supposed to be the whole time. This is beautiful. We're about to meet our child. So yeah. And how helpful are those experiences? Once again, like I said, birth, pregnancy, there are these potent experiences that catalyze us into motherhood. So when we see that we can rely on the Lord for our pregnancy, birth, labor, however it unfolds, whether it unfolds in our home alone or whether it unfolds in the OR, doesn't matter. Like, we can still put all of our faith in the Lord and in His will and perfect, beautiful timing. That transforms us in motherhood. It transforms us moment to moment when we are when we're discipling our children. So I think that's, like I've said, it's the reason that home birth and birth in general is just so powerful to me is I think that it informs us of the greater picture of parenthood, or it can, and it can just show us how beautiful it can be.
And that's like, that whole segment was just both equally as beautiful and convicting. So thank you for that. This has been an amazing conversation. I would love just to be able to share whatever resources or programs or anything that you offer with our community.
Oh, thank you so much, Raina. And, the whole conversation has been about this. My goal is to support mothers. We need support. We need a place where we can come to have these conversations and to grow in education, to even know, hey, what questions should I be asking?
Exactly.
So, of course, the Happy Homebirth podcast is a wonderful resource for stories. And then I do have courses for mothers who do want to go more in depth, and those can be found on my website at myhappyhomebirth.com.
Perfect. And I will link all of those and happily dive into them myself as we just use this next season for discernment. But I have one final question that we close for all of our guests. So if you could provide any wisdom to your younger self or for our community that is listening, what would you share?
I think this is such a fantastic question. And I believe that it's just recognizing that you were made for your baby. You know, you were made for your family. You were chosen as their mother, as their leader, their shepherd. And so don't be scared. Don't feel like you have to submit to what everybody else is telling you to do. You have a direct connection with the Lord.
Yes.
You can lean into that. You were made to be this child's baby, and you can do it well.
Oh, I love that. That was so beautiful, Katelyn. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was honestly an amazing conversation for my own heart right now.
Oh, Raina, thank you so much. It was such a joy to speak with you.
Well, I will link all of your stuff, and we will catch you guys in the next episode.
Thank you for listening, friend. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you don't want to miss any wisdom or encouragement, be sure to subscribe to the show. And don't forget to rate and review. Your feedback means so much and helps our community grow. If you're looking for more wellness wisdom and free resources, head over to livingwiselywell.com or get connected with me on Instagram at wiselywell. And if you're looking for a break from the hurried health lifestyle, check out my Return to Rest resource for tangible ways to slow down and finally find rest.